Welcome everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We have award-winning author Andrea Stumpf with us today. She is a Next Generation Indie Book Award recipient and has won multiple awards. Today she's going to be talking about two books she has written. The first is Memoirs of an Arabian Princess, and the second is Letters to the Homeland. Her ancestors, Sayyida Salme, whose pen name is Emily Ruete, published her memoir in German in 1886. She was the first Arab woman ever to publish a book. So Andrea has brought this to two books to share this history, and I think this will be a history lesson that everybody will want to hear. So welcome, Andrea, to Zoom into Books.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It is such a privilege to be able to participate in your series and Zoom into Books, and I'm hoping that it does prove to be an interesting history lesson, but also a lesson in things we can think about today. What I find so fascinating about Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete, is her relevance for us even today. So I'd like to show a few slides, if that's okay. I'll share the screen and take us through a little bit of the story, and then maybe have some time at the end for some questions if some listeners have some live, and perhaps you have some as well. I always love the question part, so hopefully there will be some.
That will be great.
Great.
And I would like to, excuse me just a second.
Oh, sure.
I'd like to encourage the viewers on Facebook Live to type their questions in the comments, and we'll make sure that Andrea answers all your questions before the end of her presentation. So Andrea, take it away.
Thank you. With pleasure. Let me share the screen and get right to it. Yeah, I hope I picked the right screen here. All right, is that visible to everyone? So today, I'm really privileged to share with you these two books, companion books, from Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete. So we kind of have two books and two names, and that will all become clearer as I go through this little presentation. I am Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete's great-great-granddaughter. So I have a special interest in sharing this with you, and also had a really special interest in publishing these books. They're self-published. I wanted them to be pretty. I wanted them to be easy to read and accessible to essentially an international audience, because they are very special from a very special person. So I'm going to start with, essentially, this is a tagline that I use. So if you go to the website, you'll see this. It's basically, let history surprise you. Let her story inspire you. So these two books, and Sayyida Salme in her writings, really give us a window into a time and place that we can hardly imagine, that we usually don't learn about. I certainly didn't learn about it in school, but that are still very relevant to us today, perhaps in some surprising ways and in some inspirational ways. So we're actually really fortunate to have these writings with the very generous details and also some very candid observations that Sayyida Salme gives us from a pretty fascinating East-West, which is to say also Orient to Occidental or North-South perspective. And that gives us a lot to think about. And before I switch the slide, I'll just mention that this little sketch of Sayyida Salme writing in this window is from my son, who just graduated from high school and is also my map maker and my illustrator for the two books. So, grateful to his participation. It's been a real family project, including, I might mention, my mother, who has really helped with the translations as well. So I'm going to frame this presentation really in 3 parts and go a little broadly first and start with the historical context before introducing you to the author herself, and then presenting the 2 translations that I have newly published, one from last year and one from the year before. So first the time, the person, and then the books. And here too, just to mention, this is a painting that hangs in my parents' home where I grew up. That was done by my great-grandmother, so the daughter of the author, the youngest daughter, and this shows the shoreline at the time of Stone Town in Zanzibar. So this is 1888 from Rosa Trömer. So starting with the time. This period that Sayyida Salme lived in was still the age of the dhows. I don't know if you're familiar with that word, but here is a dhow, these really wonderful, great Arab sailing ships that dominated the seas, at least the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, back up until the 19th century. So here we're talking about the first part of the 19th century, before the steam-powered ships started to take over towards the end of the 19th century. And in this context, because we're dealing with these sailing ships, the wind was really important, right? The dhows, of course, were powered by the wind. And so the wind, actually, we can start here, played a role through the Indian Ocean monsoons. So did you know that half of the year, the Indian Ocean monsoons actually blow from the south into the north? These are the warm winds. And then the other half of the year, it flips around and we have cool winds that are blowing from the north off of the Himalayas to the south. So it's this kind of reversal, half year up, half year down. So you could start your dhow at number 1 on this map, which my son made. That is Muscat, which is on the corner of the Arabian Peninsula, and go from there all along, follow basically the African coast all the way down to Zanzibar, which is number 2, just off of the coast of Tanzania. And then you unload your cargo, you load up some new cargo, and then in the other half of the year, you're going back up, and this time you might stop at number 3, which is Bombay in India, now Mumbai. And then as the winds are still blowing, you can continue from Bombay to Muscat. And so you repeat this cycle, and that's what they did back then. So it was really known as the trade triangle, where you would have this year after year, this cycle. And part of the reason these sailing ships were so prominent, and the Arabian nation through Oman was so visible and had so much power in this area. And so if you think about it, Zanzibar within this trade triangle was the entryway to East Africa. And that also, this trade triangle developed, powered basically the development of the island itself. So let's just take a closer look at Zanzibar in the 19th century. So with this kind of geography and these winds that were blowing, you can start to understand why Zanzibar, which is way down on the East African coast, ended up under the control of the Omani Arab Sultanate. And that was after Oman had gained control of basically the whole east coast of Africa. So who knew that Oman, which is a relatively small country these days, was such a great maritime nation back in the 19th century? This was under the Sultan Said bin Sultan. And it was also a time when the other colonial powers, the European colonial powers, were very interested in Africa as well, right? Everyone was looking for their piece of the pie. So the British, the French, the Germans were very present. And for them, that included drawing a lot of the commodities out of Africa. So we had a huge volume of ivory, for example, elephant trunks. We had lots and lots of cloves. Zanzibar, perhaps again surprisingly, became kind of the worldwide source for cloves, and Europeans really liked cloves back then. So a lot of cloves were being harvested and shipped out. And related to the cloves, and also more broadly, another commodity, and I'm sorry to have to say it this way, but basically slaves were also increasingly coming out of this ravished East African interior as part of the trade. And slavery was, in fact, big business, and Zanzibar was a major hub. Zanzibar was a major hub in many respects for slavery in terms of financing, providing supplies, and of course the sales themselves. This is essentially where many of the expeditions began and where many of the slave caravans ended. Now, you can also perhaps imagine, since I've talked about the Omani Sultanate as having control, basically governing the island. So you had royalty in charge of the island that was holding court over the African natives and the native kings, the village kings. It was also supported by scores of eunuchs and dozens of sarari, which were essentially slave concubines in the harem, along with hundreds and then later even thousands of slaves on the plantations. So another characteristic of Zanzibar is that it was a very hierarchical society. So there's a lot that we could say about East African slavery and Zanzibar's role in it, but I won't dwell on it too much here. I do have more in the book. I have an essay in the Memoirs at the back, which really goes much deeper into this topic. But I think for today, perhaps the most interesting thing is that Sayyida Salme, so the author of the Memoirs and the Letters, these two books, is a play really in contradiction and complexity on this particular topic. One of the reasons why I think it's so interesting to study her in this context. So I'll explain a bit more later, but she was born of both royalty and slavery. Her father was the Sultan, but her mother was a concubine from the harem, what they called sarari, and she was a slave. And yet, under the Arab customs, unlike the Americas, she was born a princess, despite being the daughter of a slave. And she even owned her own slaves. In fact, she was given personal slaves at her birth, so she had slaves that took care of her. And then later, she also acquired plantations and all the plantation slaves that went with them when her father died and she inherited her portion. This was at age 12, so unusually young. But then we can also trace her progression. Again, I'll say more about this later, but she ended up in Germany later, and you can perhaps imagine that by the time she got to Germany, she was the one who was being othered and essentially considered primitive and exotic. So the tables turned in that later part of her life. All right, I'm jumping ahead, but before I tell you more about Sayyida Salme, I do want to just say a bit more about her parents. So most of the emphasis in her writing, in her books, and also in the scholarship, and when people talk about her, is really about the Omani side of things. So this is Said, who was the Sultan and really this great Sultan during that period who made Zanzibar very prosperous. So we talk a lot about that. What gets less attention is her mother's side, which is really also a very important and complex history. So she was called Sayyida Salme because she was a princess. Sayyida stands for Princess Salme. But when we take note of her mother, Jilfidan, she came from Circassia and was basically brought into the harem as a Circassian slave. So what is that story? If you look for Circassia on the map today, you will not find it. And this area that is called Circassia and is east of the Black Sea and actually basically southeast of Ukraine. Circassia was in effect a peoples, a culture. There was a Circassian language, but it was never a nation. It was never a country. And then it was basically wiped off of the map and in effect eradicated by Russian incursions over the course of 100 years. So starting in 1763 and ending in 1864, this population was essentially just wiped off the map, wiped out. And it was during this time, so in the early part of the 19th century, that Jilfidan lost her family when mercenaries came through their area, killed the parents, rode off with her brother and sister, never to be seen again. And at the time, she was only 5 or 6 years old, but she must have been just old enough to be sold into slavery. We think she probably came through the Ottoman Empire to end up in Zanzibar. And even though she was so young, we also think she was probably gifted to the Sultan because she would not necessarily have been old enough to really be purchased. She ended up in the harem and became a secondary slave wife, what they called a Surya, as she grew older. And one of the really interesting facts here too is when we juxtapose the Zanzibari context with this Circassian background, it's also interesting to note that this essentially ravagement of Circassia was happening at the same time that the East African interior was being ravaged. So we have this example of what was really white slavery and the Circassian beauties, as they were called back then, including Jilfidan, juxtaposed contemporaneously, basically, with the Black slavery that was happening in East Africa. Something we don't generally acknowledge or talk about, but certainly part of this complex history. All right, that's a lot of background. So now I really would like to get to the person herself. And here she is. This is Sayyida Salme. This is probably her most iconic photo, although I have many other photos in the 2 books. She's here in her traditional attire. And as mentioned, I think actually she really looks like a princess, so you can perhaps get a sense of that from the image. As mentioned, I am her great-great-granddaughter, so just to do a little bit of lineage here, one of the things I really like is that it runs through all of the women, so it's very unambiguous. We have Sayyida Salme, and then her youngest daughter, Rosa, my great-grandmother, to her daughter, Emily, to her daughter, who is my mother, Ursula, to me. There is so much that we can talk about in her life, but one of the nice things is that she does that in her books. So we have her a voice, and I don't mean to go into many details. I'll just go through a few highlights here because the books are available for you to read if you're interested in more. She was born in 1844. Again, a daughter of royalty, Said bin Sultan, and slavery, her mother Jilfidan, the Surya. Her mother joined the harem at 6 or 7, as mentioned, but what's really fascinating is that she very unusually, as a Surya, learned how to read. So she was young enough that she was essentially raised with the other children of the concubines, basically the other princes and princesses. So she learned how to read, which most harem concubines do not. And that, I think, also led to one of the very interesting characteristics of Sayyida Salme is that she not only learned to read, which was customary for both the boys and the girls, the royal children, but she also secretly taught herself to write. That was actually very taboo at the time. The boys were allowed to write, but not the girls. But I guess being somewhat precocious and surely having some intelligence, she had the audacity to try it out on her own. She used the Quran. She wrote on the shoulder blade of a camel, and she essentially taught herself to read. Got in trouble for it, but not that much, actually, if you think about it. If you read in the books, you'll see what happens as a result of her learning teaching herself how to write. But I put these 2 things together and I think, wow, what a significant literary beginning. You know, an unusual mother in having taught herself or having been taught how to read, and then Sayyida Salme secretly having taught herself to write. So just to round out the picture, also Sayyida Salme was one of many, many children. It helps to know that there were 75 Surya in the harem. She counts them. She says that in her book. and that probably more than 100 children were born, of which 36 were still living when the Sultan died in 1856. And these households, you can imagine, were huge. There were probably 1,000 plus in multiple households by the time you add up all the eunuchs, the servants, the slaves, and then the royal family itself. Her father, the Sultan, died on the high seas between Oman and Zanzibar. He was traversing between the two in 1856. And then her mother also tragically died 3 years later in 1859 of cholera, when cholera swept through the island. So by a pretty young age, by the age of 15, she was essentially an orphan. And that may also help give a little explanation as to why she would end up doing what she did, which I will share with you on this next slide. Very unthinkably, certainly at the time, certainly for royalty, she fell in love, not with anyone, but with a German merchant, a foreigner, a stranger. The royal princesses were not supposed to be seen, much less interacting with other men. And here she was at age 22, falling in love, also got pregnant, and she ended up basically fleeing the island. So that was in 1866. She was able to leave the island on the British High Flyer, and she took the ship from Zanzibar to Aden in Yemen, and then waited until Heinrich was done with his commerce, his business. 9 months later, he arrived. And on the same day that he arrived, so this is a day, May 30th in 1867, she was baptized, essentially converted to Christianity, and took the name Emily. And then right after that was married and took the last name Ruete, her husband's name. And that very same day, they left for France and then on to Germany. We probably also worth mentioning, we have some of the details of her trip, but one of the details that she did not share, and that of course must have had a huge impact on her at the time and for the decades after, was that she gave birth to her child in Aden, took the infant Heinrich along on this train trip, and then the son tragically died in the train on the way between Lyon and Paris. So this was not even really conclusively known for generations until documentation was found in the archives. And she, for all the writing she did, never talked about it. The children were not aware, and she never wrote about it. Also tragically, and this really colors her writing later, after 3 years of living in Germany, and she describes this in the second book, and she had 3 children in that time, so Anthony, Said, and Rosa, my ancestor. Her husband, Heinrich, tragically died abruptly, suddenly, in a horse tram accident in Hamburg. And of course, at that time, she might have thought maybe she should go back to Zanzibar, but she was an infidel by then. She had essentially self-exiled herself. And she, on the other hand, really felt very passionately about staying in Germany to raise her family there in memory and devotion, memory of and devotion towards her husband. So she stayed in Germany after that, even after his tragic death. Like I said, there's so much more to tell, but she does it. And so now let me turn to the books, which is where she really provides amazing descriptions of her life growing up and her life then in Germany. So we'll start with the Memoirs. The Memoirs were published in 1886. And as far as we know, we think she is the first Arab woman ever to publish a book. I have asked around, I have done some research, I have not found anyone sooner. So if any of our listeners here know of any Arab woman who published before her, please let me know. But under her very extraordinary circumstances, and I think culturally, the fact that Arab women were not taught to write, perhaps not usually taught to read either, it may not be too surprising that she actually was the first. She wrote under the name Emily Ruete. her Christian married name, but she also put her Arabic name on the title page. You might have caught that signature on the very first slide that we saw. And as she says in her preface, she first wrote this book for her children. She wanted them, you know, as they grew older, to know what her life had been, where she had come from. And she was actually in such dire straits as she was writing this that she wasn't sure she was going to survive. So she wanted to at least have a written record for them. But she was then later encouraged to publish. So she wrote this in the kind of mid-70s and then ended up publishing in 1886. This was a very popular book when it first came out. I mean, people were very interested in these kind of, you know, explorer testimonials and, you know, different things that were happening historically then, which also fed into quite a lot of curiosity about this Arab princess. And this was in the context of a lot of caricatures about the Oriental life and harem life. She published the book in 2 volumes. I've basically pulled it together into 1 issue. And the book was issued 4 times the first year, and it was published in German, because of course she was in Germany and had been speaking German. So what I've done is take the German directly from the German and translate it into English. And then it's also been translated into other languages like French and I think Japanese, Swahili, Arab, of course. The book was revived in English in 1981, so one of the translations was then reprinted with some annotations, and it received a resurgence of interest. And we can see that basically every decade, the Google citations, if you do a search, have doubled. So starting from 2 in the 70s to more than 130 in the 2010s, and I think it's going up from there. So it is a relatively well-known book, and it is out there. Here is my book now, just to show it to you. This is self-published, it's in paperback, it's an ebook, and I did say soon audiobook. I should have updated the slide. The audiobook came out basically 2 weeks ago, so I'm super excited about that. You can download it from Audible. It's also, the book, paperback and ebooks are available at Amazon, and your bookstores can order them from Ingram Spark. Now you might ask yourself, why would I want to do a new translation when it was already translated way back when? In 1888, there were 2, one in New York, one in London, in 1907 by Lionel Strachey in New York. There's also a version in a Dutch, in a Brill book that's from a Dutch professor who published in English, a very, very good academic book. So, you know, why would I want to add to the mix? Especially because you can see on the right side here on the slide, there are just dozens of reprints. It's a whole cottage industry of reprints of this historical text. So there are many versions available to you. So why would I want to do it? And why would I highly recommend that you look at my version and not the other versions? The short answer is basically, and I go into more on my website with examples, is that these older translations are just not very accurate. One is good, but somewhat sloppy, and the other is completely distorted. And we also have pretty 19th century kind of texts, a little bit old-fashioned in the way the language is used. So what I really wanted to do was essentially rescue her voice. I wanted a book that was very accurate and authentic to her, and also easy for us to read today, you know, for a 21st century audience. And in this way, maybe it's a bit of a feminist act. I really would like today the worldwide accessibility to someone who is so important from that time and who gave us her voice, to really honor that. Now I have just jumped ahead, sorry about that. With regard to the second book, there is an additional manuscript that was not published. It was left behind by Sayyida Salme, so not published in her time. In fact, her children did not even know about this manuscript. They found it among her possessions after she died. They did end up typing it up, so I did not have to work off of this original handwritten version, which, you know, would be difficult enough, but it's also written in Old German script. Don't know if any of you can make out what it says. She titled it Briefe nach der Heimat, so that's really translated Letters to the Homeland, but it's not actually letters. It is just 3 notebooks. This is the first one here, and 2 more that look very much the same. And she just started writing and did not stop for another 600 plus pages. And she just describes, this manuscript is really about her very difficult life in Germany when she got there, the culture shock, the way she was treated, and then also the tragic death of her husband, and after that, one calamity after another. So it is somewhat of a tough read, but it's also the really raw, unedited, real deal of what she experienced at the time. So here's what it looks like. My version, again, I guess I would describe it as the sequel to the memoirs, certainly a companion book. And we have the paperback and ebook out, and the audiobook I'm working on right now. I can only say it's been just amazing, not just to speak her voice through the writing, but also to speak her voice in the audiobook directly. So it's my narration, and to be able to share that with all of you. So hopefully the second audiobook now will also be out in the July timeframe. So with these 2 books, reading each book is truly fascinating, but reading both books together is even more so. And in all of it, she is writing very perceptively, with lots of detailed observations and insights. On the one hand, describing her life growing up in Zanzibar, on the other hand, her life in Germany. And it's this amazing combined vantage point that she brings to what she writes about the East and the West, having been born in the Orient and then married into the Occident. And what's super interesting too is that so much of what she comments on is also really relevant to our questions of culture and society today. So I'll just close with really my watchwords. I have really looked to make this as accurate as possible, as internationally accessible as possible, as readable as possible. So it's not just about accuracy, but also a good read, and to stay really respectful in recognizing my responsibility as a translator and performing the art of translation, and leaving it in a way that it's her voice and authentically a representation of this very special person, Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete. And so with that, I leave you with her own voice in my 2 books, and leave you with this remarkable woman in a remarkable time, with a history that will no doubt surprise you, and a story that will hopefully inspire you. All the stories she tells and the insights that she shares. So many thanks. Herzlichen Dank. Shukran, jazilan, asante sana. I have my websites here if you'd like to look into that more, and would love to hear from you, which you can do through the websites as well. Kathy, thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to you, and I guess stop the share and see if there are any questions or anything else that I might say on the subject. Thank you.
That was fascinating, Andrea. What an amazing history, and what an amazing woman. That took a lot of nerve.
Yes.
To do what she did. And we did have one question: how in the world did she find a publisher for the
That's
first
such a great question.
book?
Yeah. I don't have those details. I will mention that a lot of the collection from the family, particularly collected by her son, Rudolf, is available in Leiden at the Leiden University libraries. And so there are records there, and there are letters and other things. But I'm not aware of any particular correspondence or even drafts going into the publication. I find it pretty fascinating that it ended up being in the West. It's almost like she had to get to the West. She had to get to Germany to be able to find a publisher. Something like this, of course, never would have happened if she had wanted to recount her childhood experience in Zanzibar. So it was only the door opened when she moved to the West. But even so, I think it's quite extraordinary that a German publisher looked to her and essentially, especially as she was there without a husband. And back then, women did not have a lot of agency. They could not have their own financial accounts. She had a guardian. She describes how difficult that was in the letters. There are many ways in which she would not, have the advantages that we have today to do something like this. But yeah, I think I give Germany a lot of credit, the German publishers, that they did this. And of course, they made a good business decision because it was an extremely popular book that first year. Many people were interested in finding about what this exotic woman had to say about her Oriental life, along with all the other explorer testimonials that were available from men who were traveling in Africa and experiencing, things from that time. Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Whoever asked it, thank you.
That's so true. Few women, I'm sure, did get published. There are some well-known authors, but particularly an Arab woman with the background that she had. I mean, he did the right thing. It's an amazing volume. So I guess the copyright ran out after 20 years, and that's why there's so many knockoffs, I guess, of the original manuscript. That's really sad. I know that does happen, but
well, if I could maybe say a word about the copyright, it's kind of an interesting point.
Okay.
It's not clear to me really what the copyright status was at the time. And of the two translations I mentioned from the turn of the century, the 1888 one and the 1907 one, the first one was authorized by the family. So she actually added an English afterword, which is in my book, in English, to that translation. The second one was not authorized by the family, and Lionel Strachey did some things to it that I think were not appropriate, particularly because he made it seem like it was from her rather than from him. But I think that was a little bit customary of the time. I think standards for translation, kind of standards of authenticity and accuracy were not what they are today. I find that there are, principles that are now being established for translators that are helpful in a way that back then it wasn't possible. What we find in Rudolph's collection, and particularly directly in the Lionel Strachey edition that they had in the family, which is part of the collection in Leiden, as I paged through, I found an article from an American newspaper about copyright. And it was lamenting the fact in the early 20th century, I forget, 19 something or other, that Congress had failed to adopt the legislation to pass the law that was going to address copyright. There's no commentary that goes with it. But the very fact that it's in Lionel Strachey's, the family's copy of his translation, kind of tells you that it was on his mind. And it's one of the reasons why I think I can confidently say, as I say in a footnote in the letters, that was an unauthorized translation. And here was the family thinking about, well, what can we do? Well, copyright there wasn't a whole lot of structure around the concept of copyright. So there wasn't much of anything the family could do. Now, ironically, I mean, history is always a little complicated that way. When the family was interested in publishing the letters later, once they found that manuscript, they actually went to the publishing company that had published Lionel Strachey's memoirs, his version of it, and asked if they would be willing to publish the letters to the Homeland. But of course, at that time, there wasn't a translation yet, and they declined. They said, no, thank you, we're not going to publish this. But I don't think they necessarily saw a huge issue with the publishing company, even if they probably had questions about the version that Lionel Strachey had published.
That's fascinating. It really is, particularly as a publisher, that was one of the first things that came to my mind too.
Yeah.
I know you said you and your mother translated the second book. How long did that take?
So I had my mother's help for all of it. And to be honest, my mother's 87, and you never know what can happen. So when I really set for myself the task or the challenge that I should just do this, it was in the middle of the pandemic, and I was thinking about, what matters. And I thought, I need to do this now because I really wanted to do this with my mother. I knew that it would be important to her, and I knew she'd be fabulous at it. She's so diligent. She was my proofreader, but she could do it, really reading the German and helping me make sure, two eyes, four eyes, make sure that we had it as accurate as possible. So I did this very quickly. I basically put everything into it rather than taking a lot of time and letting it, last years and years. But maybe I should note that the first attempt I did at translating was all the way back in 2000. We had been in Zanzibar in 1998. And I was so inspired by her voice. And I was like, I'd like to get to know her. And the best way to do it was, of course, to just read her words. And I thought, oh, let me get really close to her. Let me see what it's like to translate. And I ended up translating about a third of the book just for myself, just to see what that would be like. And I put it aside. So during the pandemic, I guess this was really 2021, I went back into my hard drive, found that storage drive, pulled up that bit and just picked up on the very next word, finished the translation as a very rough first cut, and then worked on it and had it published with a few accompanying essays and lots of photos by the end of 2022, and then immediately went into the letters. And I was like, okay, book 2. And so now was able to do that over the course of last year with a lot of intensity and some trips to Leiden and, lots of support, as I said, from my mother and also from others who were doing important research that I could bring into the book as well. And I've discovered a cousin who lives down the road from me here. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. They're right outside Washington, D.C., who also had a lot of collected material, especially photos that I was able to bring into this. So it all came together, and fortunately very quickly, so that, my mother was a huge help, and we're still working on more now.
Well, it's amazing that you had that many materials that you were able to access. To have the family collection in, is it in a museum in Germany, you said?
So it's in Leiden, which is actually in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And that might seem a little odd, but they were very good friends with a professor who was at the university there in Leiden, which is not far from Amsterdam. And the son ended up giving the collection to him as part of his Oriental Institute. So he was really a professor of Oriental studies. So the university there, University of Leiden, has taken very good care of the materials over the years. And for me, it was just important. I was born in Germany. My mother is German. We moved to the US when I was very young. I grew up speaking German. And so between having been schooled in English, so writing in English was really easy. I'm a lawyer. I spend my life writing all the time, playing with words all the time. And then to add that German piece, it just felt like kind of the perfect time and place to be able to do this.
It's amazing. The photographs really make the book. It gives us a real glimpse back that far. I know my grandmother was born in 1885, and it seems like a long time ago, but time goes along quickly.
Absolutely.
And you have pulled together an amazing collection, and I will certainly urge the viewers. I've posted all the links in the Facebook comments. You can go to Andrea's website, learn more about her, contact her. Andrea, do you do speaking engagements and conference workshops about your books?
I love to do them. I mean, I've loved being able to share with you today. I feel like there's so much history here, but so much of it is also in the conversation, the discussion around her and what it might mean for us today. I'm wide open to larger presentations, but also smaller presentations. If you have a book group and you want to read this, and then I would love to listen to what everyone has to say and maybe contribute a bit in terms of what I've been able to glean from what she's written and from some of the research. There's so much. And I would also point people to my blog, which I started in December. Every month, I try to frame a topic that out of her voice is still relevant today. And so, you know, I see it every day. I can't help it because I'm so deep in it, but I hear things on the news. I, you know, realize what people are challenged by these days, and I find wisdom in her writing or insights, particularly, you know, we don't have many Arab voices these days. Being able to put that Arab perspective, the Muslim perspective in the mix. And she, of course, became a Christian, so she was really speaking from both sides, from both perspectives, in a very kind of holistic and unified way. It's pretty fascinating, again. So I would love to, if people would like to be in touch with me, whatever the context, contribute. I also think it's very teachable material, certainly for college students, but I think also high school level for sure. And one of my goals is, after this year, pulling together a compilation, which I didn't even mention. It's the 100th anniversary of her death. She died in 1924. 2024, this is her centennial year, so I want to do an anniversary compilation with the two together. But my project after that, maybe next year if I can get it done, is to do something along the lines of a teaching guide, to just as a booklet help anyone who would like to draw from this rich material to talk to students and help them think through some of these very interesting topics.
That's a great idea. And I'm sure that you do virtual visits, and that's perfect with a book club.
Absolutely, yes.
The book club could contact Andrea through her website, and I'm sure you could buy bulk buy books for your club, and I'm sure she'd be happy to autograph them for you too.
That would be super cool. Yes, I would love to do that. Absolutely.
And after everybody's read the book, having Andrea come and do a visit with your book club to discuss the book. A lot of our authors do that, and it works out really well, particularly with technology today. You don't have to travel around the world to do this. So I know that you have an excerpt that you would like to read, so let's end with that. And if you'll go ahead, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lovely idea because I keep emphasizing her voice. So let me give you her voice, of course, translated by me, but as accurate, hopefully, as a translation can be. This is it's one of my favorite stories in her book. It comes from the Memoirs. It's actually the very last page of her volume 1 of the Memoirs. So this is how she closed the very first thing that she published. And you might see why it's worth reading. It's in the chapter called Status of Women in the Orient. And I should add, she was very mindful of writing about women, particularly their status, the rights, the culture, the relationship to the rest of society. So here she goes. I want to recognize one more family member, someone who especially belies the inferiority myths of Oriental women. My great aunt, the sister of my grandfather, is still today considered the model of a clever, courageous, and energetic woman. When the story of her life and deeds is told and retold, young and old listen with rapt attention. When my grandfather, Sultan Imam of Muscat in Oman, died, he left behind 3 children, my father, Said, my uncle Salum, and my aunt Aisha. As my father was only 9 years old, this required the establishment of a regency. Against all custom, my great-aunt declared categorically that she would run the government herself until her nephew came of age, and she forbade any opposition. The ministers, who had not anticipated such a decision, but had instead secretly looked forward to years of their own rule, had no choice but to obey. Every day, the new regent called on them to report and receive her orders and instructions. She watched over and kept up with everything. Nothing escaped her sharp gaze, to the anger of any who were disloyal and lazy. For herself, she simply stripped the shackles of proper etiquette. When appearing in front of her ministers, she covered herself only in her sheila, the outfit a lady wore to go out. Whether the world wished to carp about her approach made no difference, as she followed her own undeterred path with skill and verve. Soon enough, she was put to the most serious test. She had barely taken up the reins of government when, as unfortunately happens often in Oman, a very treacherous war erupted. Our nearest tribal neighbors believed they could easily overthrow the female regency, and with it our house, to claim the reign for themselves. Burning and killing their way through the land with their hordes, they finally arrived at the gates of the capital city, Muscat. Many thousands of people from the countryside had fled here from their ruined provinces, abandoning their land and belongings to seek refuge and aid. Muscat is well protected and can withstand a siege. But what good are the most fortified walls when supplies and munitions run out? In this challenging time, my great-aunt proved herself beyond measure and even won over the admiring respect of her enemies. At night, she always rode solo in male attire along the front lines. She managed her soldiers in the most dangerous locations, sometimes eluding an unexpected attack with only the speed of her steed. One evening, she set out especially worried. She had learned that the enemy was going to bribe its way into the fortress under the cover of night for a total massacre. She therefore decided to test the loyalty of her troops. With utmost care, she rode up in disguise to one of the sentries, demanded to speak to the Akid, a senior officer, and presented in the name of the attackers the most enticing offers. The outburst of anger that erupted from this dutiful sentry alleviated any concern about her soldiers' sentiments, even as it put her life at great risk. They immediately wanted to knock this apparent spy down, and she had to draw on her utmost skill to avoid being killed by her own people. Muscat's situation became increasingly dire. Starvation was widespread, and hearts were filled with hopelessness. There was no chance for help from the outside. It was decided to try one last desperate push, even if it meant going down with honor. They had just enough powder reserves for one more fight, but the deadly lead needed for guns and cannons was completely spent. The regent called on everyone to collect every last nail for the guns, and even the search for the right-sized pebbles to use instead of bullets. Whatever iron or brass they could find was smashed and loaded into the cannons. Her Highness even opened the doors of her treasury and had bullets poured from her Maria Theresa thalers. Everything was offered up. And lo and behold, this desperate effort paid off. The enemy was fortunately caught by surprise and scattered in every direction. More than half of their troops were left behind, dead or wounded. Muscat was saved. Freed from her heavy load, this courageous woman dropped to her knees and thanked the Almighty in ardent prayer for his merciful help. After that, she reigned in peace and was then able to transfer the kingdom to her nephew, my father, in such good shape that he could focus on other more distant goals, above all, to conquer Zanzibar. That the acquisition of this second empire was even possible is in part thanks to her, my great aunt. That, too, was an Oriental woman. And thus ends her volume 1 of the memoirs.
That's amazing. And what an inspiration.
And we should all know that that history would have probably gotten lost if she hadn't written it, because it's certainly not recorded as part of the official history of the Omani Sultanate, which, by the way, is the same Sultanate today as it was then. So Sultan Haytham and the prior Sultan Qaboos are my mother's cousins. So, like I said, it's still relevant history.
That's amazing. I will urge
Thank
everybody to pick up a copy of Andrea's books. They're available on her website and on Amazon. The links have been posted in the Facebook comments. This video will be available on the Zoom into Books Facebook page. You can watch it anytime. And in the coming weeks, it will also be uploaded to the Zoom into Books YouTube channel. For those of you who will be going to the American Library Association conference the end of this month, you'll be able to see Andrea's book and information in the Zoom into Books booth 2210. So we hope to see you there. Andrea, thank you so much for sharing with us on Zoom into Books today. And I hope you'll come back in the future.
I really do appreciate it. Thank you, Kathy, and to all the listeners and any readers, thank you for your interest and your appreciation of Sayyida Salme, Emily Ruete. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.